Once your podcast is online and you know the address of your RSS feed, it's time to tell the world about your show. Now, if you subscribe to a service like Libsyn, it'll automatically update its directories so Libsyn visitors can find your podcast on their site. And most other podcast hosting services will do the same thing. They'll update their own internal directories so your content can be found there. But ideally, you want to get word of your show out to as many people as possible, and that means submitting your podcast feed to as many podcast directories as you can. Now, there are a ton of podcast directories out there today. If you do a Google search for where to submit podcasts, you'll find a huge list of places where you can register your podcast. Some places accept any and all podcast feed submissions. Others are more selective and actually have people on staff to review your podcast first before deciding whether or not to list it on their site. The good thing is, once you're on a directory, you don't have to resubmit to them each time you release a new episode of your show, because you're submitting your RSS feed address, and that address never changes. All you have to do is update your RSS feed every time you create a new show, and as we saw earlier, podcast hosting services like Libsyn and SoundCloud do that for you automatically. But all right, where should you submit your podcast, though? Well, we can't talk about podcast directories without first mentioning iTunes. It continues to be the place where most people find podcasts, and coupled with the fact that anyone can submit their podcasts there, it's a no-brainer that this should be the first place on your list. You'll want to start at podcastsconnect.apple.com. Here you'll need to sign in with your Apple ID, so you'll need to register for one if you don't already have one, or you may want to create a separate ID just to manage your podcasts. Now, once you're signed in, you'll be asked to enter your podcast's RSS feed. So, for example, if I want to use the feed generated by my Libsyn.com account, I can go back to my Libsyn site, and if you recall, we can click the RSS button here, which gives us our RSS feed address. So I can copy that. And of course, you'll need to find your own RSS feed for wherever your site is hosted. And then I can come back to the iTunes page and paste in that address. I'll be asked to validate it first to make sure it works. Now you'll notice here that they're pretty stringent about this. I've gotten a couple of alerts here. Notice there's no description tag, I have to have artwork, and I have no category. That's because I didn't actually set these things up when I created my feed earlier. So you'll have to go back to your podcast hosting account and make sure all of your information is filled out properly in order to proceed. Then you'll be asked to fill in a variety of information. Now, different directories may ask for different information, but all of them ask for the same basic information, like the name of your podcast, your website, a description of your show, and the address of your podcast feed. Now, you'll also usually be asked to pick a category or a genre for your show, which will help place it in the right location of that directory. And again, you'll also want to have an image ready to submit along with your podcast that will act as the cover image and will appear alongside your listing. So you can see all the information here that was already pulled from my RSS feed. And if I were doing this for real, I'd want to go back to Libsyn to my settings and edit my show settings and properly fill everything out here. I'm not actually going to fill this out now because I only have a fictitious podcast here, and I don't want to mess up the directory with phony listings. But that's essentially how it's going to work with any site you submit your podcast to. Again, you may have to jump through more hoops with other directories, but it's worth adding your podcast to at least 3 or 4 more other places if you want your show to be found by more people. Other directories worth submitting your podcast to include Google Play Music. Now, they're a relatively new entry into podcast directories, but hey, it's Google. Lots of people are going to find podcasts here. You'll need a Google account, but you can sign up at play.google.com/music/podcasts/publish. And once you're here, you can click Publish. You'll be asked to sign in, and then you can walk through the process of submitting your podcast. Another very popular directory is Stitcher. They have a podcast listening app for both iOS and Android. You'll want to go to Stitcher.com and then scroll down to the footer area to find the partner sign-up link. And then click Join Us, and you'll need to create an account and then follow the instructions to submit your show. And to find other places where you can register your podcast, check out podcastplaces.com. From the main page, click Browse the Directory. And you'll see here that they list not only podcast directories, but also several podcast apps, which also often have their own directories built in. You can use the filters over here on the right to narrow down the list and help you find more specialized directories that might be good places for your show to be noticed. They even have a section here that lists blogs and podcasts about podcasts, which you might want to subscribe to yourself to find information and inspiration for your own show. And again, just by Googling something like Submit Podcasts, you'll find even more places to share your RSS feed and get your podcast out there. Also bear in mind that you can share the RSS feed yourself too via your own personal website, Facebook page, or any other social media outlet. Anyone who has your feed address can just copy and paste it into their preferred podcast listening application. For example, I'll open up iTunes here on my Mac, and I can choose File, Subscribe to Podcast, and here paste in my feed address. Now, this is the first time I'm subscribing to a podcast through this copy of iTunes. You can see I have automatically download new episodes for your subscriptions checked. I'll click Continue. And now I'm subscribed to my own podcast, and new episodes will be automatically downloaded every time they come out. And I can play them from here. So in addition to submitting your RSS feed to podcast directories, make sure to spend some time sharing the feed on your own social media platforms. And once your podcast shows up on places like iTunes, you can then share the iTunes link to them too, which some people might prefer since not everyone always knows how to manually subscribe to podcasts by pasting in feed addresses. And just so you can see how that works, I'll go to the podcast section of the iTunes Store. And once you're here, you would just find your own podcast, right-click its image, and choose Copy Link. You would then paste that link into your email newsletter, a Twitter post, and so on to be able to share a direct link to the iTunes listing so people will be able to subscribe to it from there. All right, so that's how to submit and share your podcast feed so all those podcast listeners out there can find it. Of course, getting your podcast listed on directories is really just the first step in the next phase of your podcasting. Next, you'll have to continue to release new episodes in a timely manner and constantly and consistently promote your show to increase your audience. But that part's up to you.